Hello, my name is Malva Ivana, and in this presentation, I will analyze the Indonesian translation of UNICEF Child Alert using four translation theories: Mona Baker equivalence, Catford's translation shift, collocation, and connotation. Through this analysis, I will evaluate whether the translation successfully conveys the meaning, emotional impact, and message of the source text. First, let me introduce the text. The source text is taken from UNICEF Child Alert, which discusses the humanitarian crisis in Darfur, Sudan. It describes how years of armed conflict have affected children's lives, including the destruction of school. The objective of this presentation is to evaluate the quality of translation by applying for translation theories, Mona Baker equivalence, Catford's translation shift, collocation, and connotation. Here are the source text and the Indonesian translation. Instead of analyzing the entire paragraph, I selected several key expressions that represent important translation choices. These expressions are dangerously uncertain futures, UNICEF for Child Alert, humanitarian catastrophe, witness killing, and have been displaced. These examples will help us understand how the translator balance accuracy, naturalness, and readability. The first theory is Mona Baker's word-level equivalence. This example, dangerously uncertain future, which is translation as masa depan yang sangat tidak pasti dan berbahaya. At the word level, the translator successfully transferred the core meaning because both persons describe a future that is uncertain and dangerous. However, there is a grammatical difference. In the source text, dangerously is an adverb modifying the adjective uncertain. This means the source text emphasizes how extremely uncertain the future is. In Indonesian translation, berbahaya becomes an adjective describing masa depan. As a result, the emphasis slightly changes. The translation focuses on a dangerous future, rather than a future that is dangerously uncertain. Although the overall meaning is still accurate, some semantic nuance is lost. Therefore, I suggest the alternative translation. Masa depan yang sangat tidak menentu dan penuh bahaya. This version perceives both meanings more naturally while maintaining the original emphasis. The second theory is Catford's translation shift. The first example is structure shift. The phrase UNICEF First Child Alert becomes peringatan anak pertama UNICEF. Here, the translator changes the English possessive structure into the natural Indonesian noun phrase. English follows the pattern possessor plus noun, while Indonesian uses noun plus possessor. This is classified as a structure shift. In my opinion, the shift is appropriate because a literal translation would sound unnatural in Indonesian. Therefore, the translator prioritizes readability without changing the meaning. And the second example is classic. The word dangerously, which is an adverb, is translated as berbahaya, an adjective. Although the grammatical class changes, the overall meaning remains understandable. This shows that the translation prioritizes natural expression over maintaining the original grammatical form. Therefore, communicative effectiveness is considered more important than formal equivalent. The final example is unit shift. The phrase have been displaced is translated as telah mengungsi. Although this translation is easy to understand, is it not fully equivalent? The word displaced means people are forced to leave their homes because of conflict or violence. Meanwhile, mengungsi can imply voluntary evacuation. Therefore, part of the original humanitarian meaning is weakened. The third theory is collocation. The first example is humanitarian catastrophe, translated as bencana kemanusiaan. This is an appropriate collocation because bencana kemanusiaan is a common expression in Indonesian media and humanitarian reports. Therefore, the translation sound natural and acceptable. The second example is witness killing, translated as menyaksikan pembunuhan. Although grammatical correct, this phrase sounds slightly less natural in Indonesian. The English word killing emphasizes the violent act itself, whereas pembunuhan refers more to the event or crime. In my opinion, expressions such as menyaksikan aksi pembunuhan or menyaksikan orang-orang dibunuh better reflect the meaning of the source text. The fourth theory is connotation. The first example is word trip, which is translated as terjebak, but words carry a strong negative connotation. They suggest that the children are powerless, unable to escape, and forced to remain in a dangerous situation. In my opinion, the translator successfully perceived the emotional impact of the original text. Indonesian readers can still feel the sense of fear, helplessness, and the vulnerability experienced by the children. The second example is their right flagrantly violate, translated as hak-hak mereka dilanggar secara terang-terangan. The adverb flagrantly emphasizes that the violations are repeated and committed without shame or concern for the law. The Indonesian expression secara terang-terangan successfully conveys this strong negative connotation. Therefore, the translation maintains both the meaning and the emotional force of the such text. Overall, the translation has several stages. First, it successfully communicates the main message of the search text. Second, most translation shift improve readability for Indonesian readers. And finally, the emotional tone is generally maintained. However, there are also some weakness. One example is millions have been displaced, translated as jutaan orang telah mengungsi. This translation is less accurate because displaced refers to people who are forced to leave their homes, while mengungsi does not always express that coercion. Therefore, a more accurate translation would be jutaan orang terpaksa meninggalkan rumah mereka or jutaan orang mengalami pengungsian akibat konflik. So, in conclusion, the Indonesian translation is generally accurate, natural, and acceptable because it successfully conveys the main message and emotional tone of the such text. And for my final verdict is that this translation is generally successful. Nevertheless, several expressions could be revised to improve semantic accuracy while maintaining natural Indonesian. Overall, this analysis shows that translation is not simply replacing words from one language with another. Instead, it requires balancing equivalent accuracy, readability, and cultural acceptability to produce an effective translation. And I think that's all for my explanation. Thank you for watching.